this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we will continue our discussion of the question of the meaning of life. And you'll recall in our previous video, the main purpose we had there was to draw a distinction between asking questions about what it means to be happy or satisfied or live a pleasant life, and what it means to live a meaningful life. And whereas we said, you might say, although this would be controversial, but you might say that a happy life consists of getting what you want, or being, or feeling pleasure and having the absence of pain. There seems to be something different between that and what it means to live a life with meaning, a life that matters, a life with purpose, or a life where you're committed to some goal or something larger that's outside of yourself. So there seems to be this difference. And so the question we're primarily asking here is it possible for us to live a life that matters, a life that's meaningful? And if it is possible, then where does that meaning come from? We all know where pleasure comes from. We all understand where satisfaction comes from. But where does meaning come from? Does it need a different kind of source? And we're going to begin to delve into that topic in this video. Now, last time we began to look at Richard Taylor's essay, The Meaning of Life. And we saw how he introduces the question of the meaning of life, and how he tells us it can be quite a disturbing question when you begin to think about it, given that it seems to need an answer if you're going to justify not just any of the activities you do on a day-to-day basis, but even the very purpose you have for living in the first place. And the thought or the possibility that we can't give an answer to that, the thought or possibility that perhaps our lives could lack meaning, is for that reason goes to the very core of human existence. It is so fundamental that it really would be quite disturbing, even quite, maybe even frightening, to consider the possibility that your life does not have meaning. So he tells us for any reflective person, we see how this question needs an answer. The only question really is, how do we go about doing that? And Taylor suggests to us the best way to start is maybe not to start thinking about what does a meaningful life look like, but instead, let's think about what does a meaningless life look like. So he tells us, if then we can bring before our minds a clear image of meaningless existence, then perhaps we can take a step toward coping with our original question by seeing to what extent our lives, as we actually find them, resemble that image. So here's this strategy. We try to paint a picture of what a perfectly meaningless life would look like, and then we ask the question, are our lives like that? To what extent? And if they are like that, in what ways are they like that image of perfect meaninglessness? So what is the image he uses? Well, he uses a rather famous image of meaninglessness called the ancient myth of Sisyphus. So I'll read through for you what he says here. He says, a perfect image of meaninglessness of the kind we are seeking is found in the ancient myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, it will be remembered, betrayed divine secrets to mortals, and for this he was condemned by gods to roll a stone to the top of a hill, the stone then immediately to roll back down, again to be pushed to the top by Sisyphus, to roll down once more, and so on again and again forever. So the basic idea is that according to the legend, Sisyphus did something to anger the gods, and they punished him not by forcing him to undergo some horrible immediate torture, you might say, but just by doing a sort of an unending labor. And that unending labor was to push a stone to the top of this hill, watch it roll back down again, and do that for all eternity. And the reason Taylor thinks this is significant is because he says, here in this picture, we have a picture of meaningless, pointless toil, of a meaningless existence that is absolutely never redeemed. It is not even redeemed by a death that, if it were to accomplish nothing more, would at least bring this idiotic cycle to a close. And so the reason he thinks this is a picture of meaninglessness is precisely because of its pointlessness, because there is no, as they'll say later, significant culmination. There's apparently no reason he is rolling this stone up a hill other than the gods just forced him to do so. And so as he continues to say, his repetitive toil is his life and reality, and it goes on forever. And it is without any meaning whatever. Nothing ever comes of what he is doing, except simply more of the same. Nothing comes of it, nothing at all. So we can probably agree that this, in fact, is a picture of meaninglessness. It's not just a life you wouldn't want to live, but a life that wouldn't even be worth living in the first place, for which there is no purpose or point to it. And if we agree that this is a good picture of a meaningless existence, then Taylor says, well, now we can come up with a sort of definition or characterization of what it means to live a meaningless life. And so he says, at first he says, we can pull these defining characteristics of meaningless as the following. One, what we see in the myth of Sisyphus is a repetitious cyclical activity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. That two, never comes to anything. And he gives a few other examples that would also make this point. He says, imagine two persons transporting a stone or even a precious gem, it does not matter, back and forth relay style. One carries it to a near or distant point where it is received by the other, is returned to its starting point, there to be recovered by the first, and the process is repeated over and over. Except in this relay, nothing counts as winning, nothing brings the contest to any close, each step only leads to a repetition of itself. So each participant in this very odd relay just passes a precious gem back and forth for all eternity. And it's interesting here that he imagines a precious gem because, yeah, it's like, wow, usually when we carry precious materials, there's some place we need to go with them. Someone wants them. We're going to sell them. We're going to buy them. No, we're just passing it back and forth. There's no point or purpose to the entire endeavor. He also says, imagine two groups of prisoners, one of them engaged in digging a prodigious hole in the ground that is no sooner finished than it is filled in again by the other group. The latter then digging a new hole that is at once filled in by the first group, and so on endlessly. And I think it's instructive that he says, we're imagining two groups of prisoners here, because if you really wanted to make someone's life as horrible as possible, it's of course bad enough to be a prisoner. It's bad enough to be imprisoned and be in jail and shut off from society and lacking your freedom and not able to pursue the projects you want to pursue. But suppose you then force someone to engage in pointless toil and labor. And you might think it's bad enough to force a prisoner to engage in labor. But what if the labor they were forced to participate in was not even going to be of any benefit to anyone? Then not only do they have the sort of boredom and lack of freedom and the pain that involves, but also the sense that none of this even makes any difference. And so he says, with these examples in mind, we can see that what really characterizes a life that would be completely lacking in meaning would be doing the same thing over and over again for no purpose. Now, I think there's a further question we should ask here about this definition, because it does have these two elements, repetitious cyclical activity that never comes to anything. And I think the second part is pretty incontrovertible, right? If you really did think your life and your actions never came to anything, there was never some culmination or purpose, that is a good reason to possibly think your life could be meaningless. But we might ask, what about this repetitious cyclical activity component? Is that really necessary? So one of the things Taylor emphasizes here is that when you think about Sisyphus, the problem with his life isn't really that it's boring. And it's not primarily that it's difficult or painful or laborious. He says, now what stands out in all these pictures as oppressive and dejecting is not that the beings who enact these roles suffer any torture or pain, for not be assumed that they do. Right? I mean, you might say, well, okay, pushing a boulder seems pretty torturous and painful. What about just passing the gem back and forth? That's not incredibly difficult. Nor is it that their labors are great, for they're no greater than the labors commonly undertaken by most people most of the time. It is not that his great struggle comes to nothing, but that his existence itself is without meaning. Nothing comes of it. The work is simply pointless. Right? The problem isn't that the labor this person's undergoing is difficult, right? If it was just that Sisyphus was undergoing great and difficult labor, but that labor was going to bring about some greater good, then we can say, well, look, maybe it's not a life I would want to live. Maybe I'm a lazy person. I would rather just sit around watching Netflix and eating Cheetos. Maybe that's the case. But your life wouldn't be meaningless because you would be doing something presumably important even if it was difficult. And in fact, we all the time engage in difficult tasks for some important good, and we think that the people who do so successfully are oftentimes great heroes, people who engage in self-sacrifice and do something hard and difficult and courageous for the common good. So it's not that Sisyphus labor is difficult, but it's that it's pointless, it's purposeless, it lacks any meaning. Another way to think about it, the world would be just as good a place, the world would run just as smoothly, be just as happy, be just as flourishing, if Sisyphus didn't do this task at all in the first place. And I think that when you get to the core of meaninglessness, that's what it's really all about. If you ever have a moment in your own life where you're wondering whether your own life is meaningful, whether the things you do matter, your thought process might go along the lines of, if I wasn't doing this thing, if I wasn't engaged in this project, if no one was engaged in this project, if I didn't even exist, would that make any real difference in the world? And that's why, when you think about the phrase, the idea of wanting to make a difference, it's the idea of your life doing something productive that wouldn't have been done otherwise. Sisyphus' life is a perfect example of a life where much is done, but no difference is made. Okay, so we have this idea, this image of meaninglessness, but the next question that Taylor wants to ask is, okay, is there any way that we could modify this picture of Sisyphus that would make his life meaningful? Now look, of course you could change the whole scenario and say, well, he was never punished by the gods and got to live a free life where he engaged in many important projects and helped people, right? But stay within the basic framework, right? We're imagining that Sisyphus still has to roll this boulder up the mountain. The question is there any way that you can imagine rolling a boulder up a mountain over and over and over again, or at least for a long period of time, could be meaningful? And Taylor says, well, there's really two ways that we can imagine this could be the case. So here's the first way we could change the scenario a little bit. Taylor says, but if we suppose that these stones, instead of rolling back to their places as if they had never been moved, were assembled at the top of the hill and they're incorporated, say, in a beautiful and enduring temple, then the aspect of meaninglessness would disappear. His labors would then have a point. Something would come of them all. And although one could perhaps still say it was not worth it, one could not say that the life of Sisyphus was devoid of meaning altogether. Meaningfulness would at least have made an appearance and we could see what it was. So first we can imagine that Sisyphus is rolling a bunch of boulders up over and over and over again, but these boulders are going to be used to make stones to build this beautiful and enduring temple. And look, maybe Sisyphus isn't, maybe he doesn't care that much about the temple. Maybe he won't even use it. Maybe it'll just benefit others, right? But even if that's the case, and even if he's not living a great life, we can at least say his life has some purpose, it has some sort of meaning. Because the labor he is undertaking has a point, there's an end. So that's one way we could change the scenario. We can imagine that these stones being rolled up were going to be used to build something great. There's also a second way in which we can imagine that maybe his life would be meaningful, although this is a little more perhaps controversial in terms of whether this constitutes a meaningful life, but that's part of what we're going to discuss. But in any case, here's a second modification that Taylor imagines. Let us suppose the gods, while condemning Sisyphus to the fate just described, at the same time as an afterthought, wax perversely merciful by implanting in him a strange and irrational impulse, namely a compulsive impulse to roll stones. So what are we imagining? We're imagining that now the gods, look, they've told Sisyphus he has to roll these stones up this mountain forever and ever and all of eternity, but they feel a little bad about it. They're like, wow, we've really condemned him to a horrible life, a horrible existence. So, maybe we should be a little merciful here. You know what we'll do? We're going to implant in his brain this undeniable, strange, and irrational impulse to just roll stones. We're going to change his brain chemistry, we're going to change his personality, we're going to change Sisyphus' mind so that the only thing he wants to do, his total and singular focus in his entire life, is to roll stones. Now, on the one hand, we say this would be a merciful action because, before he was rolling stones and he hated it, and one of the things we talked about in the lesson on immortality is that there's no activity that you could sustain for thousands and millions and billions and trillions of years that you would not eventually get tired of, that you would not eventually get bored to the point of just unspeakable despair. But if you're going to live an eternal life, and if you're going to be able to have your mind change so you could focus your attention on one specific activity and never get tired of that activity, then we might say, well, maybe an eternal or immortal life would be great. So on the one hand, it seems like the gods have been merciful. They've granted Sisyphus the opportunity to take great joy in doing the same thing over and over again. In that respect, he's very much like my 1.5-year-old son, who also can take joy in doing the same repetitive activity day after day after day and not seem to realize that he's already done this many times. He's already played with those blocks. He's already flipped through that book, etc. So it seems like it's merciful, but Taylor also thinks it's perverse. He says they call this perverse because from our point of view, there's clearly no reason why anyone should have a persistent and insatiable desire to do something so pointless. Right? When I look at my son and I see him doing an activity which to me seems pointless, like sorting his books, right? He takes 3 books on his left side, puts one by one all the books on his right side, puts them back on the left, back on the right, and he'll do that for a period of 20 minutes and be perfectly content. Now, from my point of view, that seems insanely boring. I can't imagine anyone enjoying that. But, he's 1.5 years old, so we don't expect anything more. We say that's totally natural. This is what, babies and toddlers do. But, of course, Sisyphus is a grown man who we suppose should have the attention and the mental development of a grown man, where you don't just get sort of so engrossed in pointless, trivial, and repetitive activities. And so it seems perverse that he should be fundamentally changed, fundamentally brainwashed to want to enjoy doing something like that. But in any case, you can certainly imagine how if the gods were to give him that strange and irrational impulse, then his life would be greatly improved, because now he's saying, Rolling Stones is great, I'm having so much fun, and I'll never get tired of this. Right? And Taylor continues to explain this, and there's so many connections here with our lesson on immortality. Again, he says, look, now Sisyphus, he doesn't even need to fear death, for the gods have promised him an endless opportunity to indulge a single purpose without concern or frustration. He will be able to roll stones forever. And it's really important when we're considering this second modification to notice what has changed and what hasn't. Taylor emphasizes that when we imagine Sisyphus having this strange and irrational impulse to roll stones, exactly the same things happen as before. The only change is in Sisyphus' view of them. He's doing the same exact activity, rolling the same stone up the same mountain for the same eternal and endless period of time. All that's changed is the way that Sisyphus now thinks about that action. He now, because of the strange and irrational impulse the gods have given him, he now thinks this is a great blessing. As Taylor says, the only thing that has happened is this. Sisyphus has been reconciled to it, and indeed more has been led to embrace it. Not by reason or persuasion, but by nothing more rational than the potency of a new substance in his veins. So he hasn't been talked into or persuaded that Rolling Stones is great. He was just engineered or brainwashed to think it so. And this is what caused him to change his view. So in any case, we have these 2 different possibilities, right, for how we might say Sisyphus' life could be made meaningful. And this matches on to an important point here for understanding Taylor's article, that he's really discussing 2 different types of meaning. So maybe it's the case then we ask, okay, is someone living a meaningful life? It could be the case that the answer to that question isn't a simple yes or no. It might depend on what kind of meaning are you talking about. So on the one hand, we might have what we call objective meaning. And this is a type of meaning that arises from the inherent value of the actions, activities, and projects a person performs. So if you're doing something inherently valuable that's important in and of itself, if you are trying to make a new scientific discovery or create a beautiful work of art or build a strong and lasting relationship with a significant other, we might say all those are objectively good things. If you achieve those things, you're bringing good into the world. And if your life is oriented toward those things, then maybe your life gains meaning because of the objective value of those things. But now imagine for a second a scientist engaged in making a scientific discovery or breakthrough, and that person recognizes or acknowledges that this would be a good thing, right? Let's say they're trying to find the cure for cancer. If you ask this person, they say, of course, if we had a cure for cancer, that would be a wonderful thing, something objectively meaningful, something objectively important. But suppose the scientist also just doesn't get that much enjoyment out of it. They have great skill in science, but they really don't enjoy the experiments that much. On a day-to-day basis, they don't enjoy what they're doing, even though they recognize it's important. We might say in that case that this person's life has objective meaning because of its purpose in helping humanity, but it lacks subjective meaning. This is a type of a meaning that arises from how the person, him or herself, views the actions, activities, and projects she performs or engages in. So subjective meaning isn't so much about whether the activities you do are oriented toward a good end. It's about how do you feel about those activities? Do you enjoy them? Do they fulfill you? Do they satisfy you? Do they give you a sense of meaning in your life? And I think we can further explain the difference between these two by thinking about some of the examples that we've talked about so far. So I'll come back to the experience machine again in a second, but consider all the modifications of the Sisyphus story. In the original story, where Sisyphus is simply cursed to roll stones up a large mountain or hill forever, we'd say his life lacks objective and subjective meaning. On the one hand, there's no further culmination, there's no greater purpose to rolling the stones, so nothing objectively meaningful is accomplished. And also he hates it, so there's no subjective meaning. On the other hand, when we imagine Sisyphus was rolling the stones to create a beautiful and enduring temple, now his life has objective meaning, but it lacks subjective meaning, right? He's doing something important, or at least something good. There's at least a purpose to his life. But again, he still hates it. It's still unfulfilling. It's unsatisfying. So we'd say his life lacks subjective meaning. In the second modification, where we imagine Sisyphus has this strange and irrational impulse to roll stones, now his life lacks objective meaning, right? There's still no purpose, right? There's no beautiful and enduring temple. He's not rolling the stones or engaging in this labor to provide power to some city or town. There's no purpose to his actions. He just does the same thing over and over again for all eternity. But he loves it. It's fulfilling, it's pleasurable, it's satisfying, it fulfills his deepest needs, his deepest desires. And so his life lacks objective meaning and has subjective meaning. So we can see how these can come apart. And even in my scientist example, again, we would say that's a case where that person's life had objective meaning but no subjective meaning, because finding a cure for cancer is good in itself objectively, but subjectively the person doesn't enjoy it. And we can even come back to the experience machine here and ask the same sort of question. So, is there subjective meaning in the experience machine? It seems there has to be, right? Because if the computer can scan your brain and figure out what would be the best, happiest, most pleasurable life for you, how could you not enjoy the experience machine? Is there objective meaning? Well, this might be more controversial. I'm tempted to say no, because nothing you do is real. No accomplishments that you make actually happen through your own effort. None of your actions help anyone. It's all just a simulation. So I'd be tempted to say no. On the other hand, this could be controversial in that it just depends on how meaningful you think it is to simply pursue pleasure. In any case, though, we can see this difference between objective and subjective meaning. And the reason this matters is because here is what Taylor is going to argue. He is going to argue that our lives as human beings lack objective meaning. There is no objective meaning to our human life. And of course, that might be a depressing result, because it means that fundamentally there is no final, significant, ultimate culmination to the things we do. And now we're back in that thought process where we say, well, if there is no ultimate good end or final end or purpose to what we're doing, why do anything? Why engage in the daily actions of my life? Why engage my projects? Why live at all in the first place? But he says there's opportunity for redemption. He thinks, in fact, our lives are very much like the variation of the Sisyphus story, or at least they can be, the variation of the Sisyphus story where he's rolling stones up a hill by a strange and irrational impulse. He thinks that although human lives lack objective meaning, that they can have subjective meaning. There is no ultimate culmination of human life, but we can still engage in our projects with passion. We can engage in our activities with a desire to do them. We can find fulfillment and satisfaction in the activities of our lives. And he thinks ultimately this can get over the embarrassment or the depressing finding that our lives lack objective meaning. Taylor thinks subjective meaning is enough. Now, whether that's right is something we'll have to discuss more in the next video, but I want to spend the remainder of this video explaining to you why Taylor thinks that human life lacks objective meaning. I want to explain to you why he thinks human life, when you consider it in close detail, is very much like Sisyphus rolling a boulder up a hill with no end in sight. Now, to see why Taylor thinks that human life lacks objective meaning, we need to put a little finer point on what the reflections so far show us about what it means to live a meaningful life. So how has it helped us to see what meaninglessness is? So Taylor says, meaninglessness is essentially endless pointless, and meaningfulness is therefore the opposite. Activity, and even long, drawn-out, and repetitive activity, has a meaning if it has some significant culmination. So when we're thinking about objective meaning, that is really the phrase I want you to keep in mind. The defining characteristic of objective meaning is an activity or life or project that has a, quote, significant culmination. So the question is, does human life have a significant culmination or not? And another way to put this, he asks, which of these pictures does our human life in fact resemble? Does it resemble Sisyphus pushing a stone up a hill to build a beautiful and enduring temple, in which case it would have objective meaning? Or does it resemble Sisyphus just rolling the stones up and down the hill forever with no purpose, but having a great time doing it? And again, what he's going to say is that, in fact, not only human life, but all biological life cannot have objective meaning. And again, at this, he starts with this example because he wants to start from all forms of biological life and just show how the same thing applies to human life. And he starts with this example of these glowworms in New Zealand. He says, thus, for example, there are caves in New Zealand, deep and dark, whose floors are quiet pools and whose walls and ceilings are covered with soft light. As you gaze and wonder in the stillness of these caves, it seems that the Creator has reproduced there in microcosm the heavens themselves, until you scarcely remember the enclosing presence of the walls. So here's a picture of what he's talking about, these glowworms in New Zealand, and they do look magnificent from this sort of objective vantage point or a third-person point of view. It looks beautiful, it looks stunning. But then when you sort of peel back the facade and you ask, well, what is actually going on here to create this beautiful picture? He continues on, as you look more closely, however, the scene is explained. Each dot of light identifies an ugly worm, whose luminous tail is meant to attract insects from the surrounding darkness. As from time to time one of these insects draws near, it becomes entangled in a sticky thread lowered by the worm and is eaten. This goes on month after month, the blind worm lying there in the barren stillness, waiting to trap an occasional bit of nourishment that will only sustain it to another bit of nourishment until what? What great thing awaits all this long and repetitious effort and makes it worthwhile? Well, really nothing. So he says, when you examine closely what's actually going on with these glowworms that look magnificent from a distance, it's just a bunch of very simple organisms just laying around and eating. They just lay around, wait to trap another insect or something to eat, and they just keep doing this over and over and over again until they die. And in fact, Taylor says this is what you see in all living biological organisms. All living things present essentially the same spectacle. The larva of a certain cicada burrows in the darkness of the earth for 17 years, through season after season, to emerge finally into the daylight for a brief flight, lay its eggs, and die. This all to repeat itself during the next 17 years, and so on to eternity. right? And he uses examples from all different forms of biological life, but the cicadas are a great example. They have these 17-year life cycles that they just repeat over and over and over and over again. This whole, the whole species just sort of recapitulates itself, right? It reproduces, it dies off, it reproduces, they die off, etc., 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 for all eternity, I guess, until until the earth can no longer sustain that form of life. And so you see this all over the animal kingdom. And when you think about that, when you just see these biological species reproducing themselves over and over and over again in a repetitious cycle, you have to ask the question, why? To what point? To what purpose? What is the meaning here? Why do any of this? And of course, we might accept that. We might say, well, yeah, okay, maybe animal life isn't that meaningful, but we weren't really interested in the meaning of animal life. We were interested in the meaning of human life. But how different, in fact, is human life? Taylor says, one is led to wonder what the point of all of it is. With what great triumph this ceaseless effort, repeated itself through millions of years, might finally culminate, and why it should go on for so long, accomplishing nothing, getting nowhere. But then you realize there's no point to it at all, that it really culminates in nothing, that each of these cycles is so filled with toil, is to be followed only by more of the same. The point of any living thing's life is evidently nothing but life itself. Each generation just continues to produce another generation, and another, and another. And if you're a reflective person, as he said at the very beginning of the essay, you have to wonder, why are we doing this? And given that we're talking about future generations of biological species, human beings included, I think the question of parenthood once again comes up here. So I remember in the hospital right after my son Mason was born, I texted my friend and I said, is this a good thing for my life, right? Well, is this a benefit to me? Is this something, right, that will make my life more fulfilling and more happy and more satisfied? I asked him because he already had a child who was at that point was 3 or 4 years old. And he said, well, it's definitely not going to make your life happier, but it will make your life more meaningful. It's very much like, a soldier jumping on a landmine to save one of his fellow soldiers. It's an act of self-sacrifice for the sake of another, and that is a good thing. And of course, that's true. Parenthood is the sacrifice of your own happiness and pleasure at many points for the sake of another. But the thing that led me to think about is, well, okay, if that applies to me, then it presumably would also apply to my son. Because let's say he grows up one day and has kids, and he says, Dad, what's the purpose of this? Well, I say, you're sacrificing on behalf of the next generation. And then the next generation grows up and sacrifices on behalf of that generation. Each sacrifice is made just for what purpose? For more sacrifice in the future. Each sacrifice seems to be made just to perpetuate the human species. But why are we perpetuating the human species? What is the end of all this constant reproduction and perpetuation? Again, remember the question, what is the significant culmination that makes all this activity meaningful? And what Taylor is going to say is that human life, just like any other form of biological life, lacks any objective meaning. When you look at it from a larger third-person standpoint, from a more objective point of view, all you see is a species that is perpetuating itself into an eternal existence, into essentially with no end. And I love this quote, the way he explains this. This life of the world thus presents itself to our eyes as a vast machine, feeding on itself, running on and on forever to nothing. And we are part of that life. So it's so easy in our day-to-day lives to get so caught up in the things we're doing and think they're so meaningful and important, and not to really think about the larger picture. You're so caught up in saying, oh, well, if I get this job opportunity, my life will be great. If I don't, my life's going to fall apart. If, this person I want to be my significant other accepts me, then I'll find happiness in my life. If I don't, my life will fall apart. But you might say, what difference does any of that make? Someone else will get the job. That person will find another significant other. The human species will go on without you. We're all going to die, and and given a sufficient amount of time, none of our accomplishments or anything we do will be remembered. And we might say, well, this is going to be the same each generation. Each generation is just going to do the same thing. So if we're just perpetuating the human species forever and there's no significant culmination, then how in fact can human life have any objective meaning? And Taylor's answer simply is that it doesn't. There's a few good passages here where he makes this point. We toil after goals, most of them, indeed every single one of them, of transitory significance, and having gained one of them, we immediately set forth in the next, as if that one had never been, with the next one essentially being more of the same. And if we think, unlike Sisyphus, these labors do have a point that they culminate in something lasting and independent of our own deep interests in them, very worthwhile, then we simply have not considered the thing closely enough. Here's really the main point. No matter what you might accomplish in your life, whether it's making a scientific breakthrough or creating something beautiful or a great athletic accomplishment or whatever it is, or building a loving and stable and lasting family, none of that will last. It will end. Everything in this life is finite. Everything in this life is temporary. The only thing that seems to go on is just repeating generation after generation. And if nothing lasts, if everything's temporary, if everything's finite, if everything has an end, then what is the significant culmination? Looked at in the way Taylor is looking at it, human life indeed, from generation to generation, can seem like just one of the trip up Sisyphus mountain with one of those stones and boulders. A bunch of effort essentially expended to no significant culmination, no ultimate end. So, if Taylor's right, then human life doesn't have objective meaning. And the extent to which this is depressing is going to depend on what do we think about subjective meaning? And is there some other source that we can find objective meaning in? Those questions we will have to save for future videos, however, so I will stop this video there. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.